Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, members and guests, and welcome to the Australian Institute of International Affairs, Western Australia. My name is Brendan Augustine, and I'm the president of the Institute here in WA and have the great privilege of being so. I would like to begin, as is our custom, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we are gathering today, the Wajak people of the Noongar Nation. I pay my respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. I know there are a few people here that probably haven't been to an AIIA event, so indulge me in giving you a little bit of a brief introduction on our institute. It was founded here in Australia in 1923 or 24. There's a bit of a debate between Sydney and Melbourne, that usual competition, with a mission to help Australians know, understand, and engage more in international affairs. The date in the 1920s is very relevant because it came out of the disaster of the First World War, where, as many experts and historians describe it, we as the international community sleptwalked into a global conflict. The idea being that the people of the world, the people of the countries that ended up being belligerents in the war, needed to know more about what their governments were getting into. Interestingly, our sister organization, the South African Institute of International Affairs, was established around that same time, give or take 10 years, reflecting a shared recognition, even then, of the importance of informed public discussion on global issues. In 2024, I had the opportunity to visit the South African Institute of International Affairs at the University of Witwatersrand in Joburg, where it is based. It was a valuable reminder of the enduring role that institutions like ours play across different national contexts in fostering informed debate on international affairs. Before we continue, I'd like to acknowledge and thank Dr. James Arvanitakis, who is not here tonight, and his team at the Forest Research Foundation for their continued partnership and support in hosting events such as this in this excellent venue. It is a partnership we greatly value. I would also like to extend our sincere thanks to the WA branch of the South African Military Veterans Organization of Australasia, SAMVOA. Thank you for your generous support this evening in sponsoring the beautiful wines from South Africa. Thank you. Tonight, we are very fortunate to be joined by Dr. Tony Turton, who will speak on the theme South Africa, from security state to democracy, inside the end of apartheid. South Africa's transition from apartheid to democracy remains one of the most significant political transformations of the late 20th century. While often remembered through the lens of reconciliation and moral leadership, it was also shaped by a complex set of internal pressures, regional conflicts, and international dynamics that gradually made the continuation of the system untenable. What makes Dr. Turton's perspective particularly compelling is that he did not observe this as a transition from the outside. He lived and worked through it from within the state itself. He began his career in the South African Defence Force, serving in the Armoured Corps during a period when the apartheid regime was deeply embedded in regional security conflicts. He was then recruited into the National Intelligence Service, where he worked in covert counter-espionage and intelligence operations at a time when the state was under increasing internal and external pressure. Importantly, of course, Anthony's career did not end with the apartheid regime. He went on to serve in the post-1994 democratic government, becoming a founding member of the South African Secret Service under the leadership of President Nelson Mandela. Serving both in the apartheid-era state and the new democratic order that replaced him has provided him with a rare dual perspective on how institutions adapt, transform, and in some cases endure through profound political change. His experience, therefore, spans not only the operational realities of a security state under pressure, but also the challenges of building new institutions in a democratic context, a transition that required not just political vision, but also practical negotiation, intelligence, and strategic recalibration. Following this phase of his career, Dr. Turton moved into the world of research and policy, where he developed an international reputation as an expert in water security and environmental governance. Dr. Turton will speak for around 30 minutes before opening the floor to questions from the audience. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Anthony Turton.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, folks. It's a great privilege to stand here before you. I'm humbled by the reception that we receive here. I recognize my brothers in Samvoa, South African military veterans. I'm going to tell them something tonight that they maybe haven't heard about. And I'm going to hopefully tell some of you something that you haven't heard about the secret situation that happened in South Africa, the negotiations that basically prevented South Africa from collapsing into a messy state, failed state, and ultimately gave birth to a multi-party democracy that unfortunately has tended to degenerate since then. But nonetheless, I'm not talking about subsequent to that. I'm just talking about what happened at that moment in time, that period building up to the 1990s and early 2000s. So it's my pleasure, if you look at this slide here, on the right-hand side of your slide, this was a front page of a journal of security studies called Nongai. And it's a journal of security studies, and it was the obituary to Dr. Neil Barnard, who was my boss. And I had the privilege of contributing to that. And what's interesting is that this is a blog from a black South African, and that's significant because South Africa is very racialized. So the black South African was saying those things there at the bottom, that the end of an era has come. But of course, what he didn't know is that Barnard didn't operate alone. Barnard was the top, he was the tip of the iceberg. Under the sea level of change was a whole bunch of highly competent professionals, of which I had the privilege to be one of, and on whose behalf I speak tonight as a proud professional. My wife was angry that I chose to wear this belt. She felt that my belt should be more formal, but the belt that I'm wearing is the only belt that I know of that's got the logo of that organization there, the Chief Director of COVID Operations. So I'm here tonight to tell you a little bit of the story about COVID operations. There's a lot of time pressure, so there's a lot of stuff to tell you. And the problem with telling the story is that it's such a complex story that you've got to go back and forth because you go into each strand of the story, and then you've got to, you run down that strand, then you've got to come back to the beginning again. So I'm going to try and do the best that I can to tell this very complicated story in the most compelling way that I can. So that's the important things. Let's set the scene. The Cold War was very hot in Southern Africa. In fact, the Battle of the Lomba in 1987, which none of you have probably heard about. Maybe 2% of people in this room have heard about the Battle of the Lomba. It was a battle bigger than the Battle of El Alamein, which many of you might well have heard about in North Africa. My father was a veteran of the Battle of El Alamein, and I had the privilege of being part of that in various ways. I was actually handling an agent at that point in time that we managed to turn from the Cuban side. So the Battle of El Alamein was a huge ding-dong event, absolute cataclysmic event. And if you want to know more about it, I'm going to give mention to a couple of books here. I have spoken to the Lane bookstore, and they've got a list of these books. So if you're interested in any of these, just let them know. They have been forewarned, and they will be able to get them for you. But there's this particular book, Rattles on the Lomba, is a significant book because it talks about one of the big battles where there was a force disparity of 10 to 1. 10 to 1. 10 to 1 force disparity, 3,000 against 30,000. It was an amazing battle, and this is a story of Charlie's Squadron, which is the armored squadron, but there's another equally compelling story, Bravo Company. Young boys just out of school that were now committed to frontline, offensive, hostile combat operations, and their story has not yet fully been told. So I'm speaking on behalf of these silent people. And during the Battle of the Lomba, a very significant thing happened because that bit of equipment was captured. And that was an SA-8 anti-aircraft missile system. South Africa had lost air superiority. There's some pilots here in the South African delegation. They will know what it means to operate on the ground when you've lost air superiority, and that was through that system, that SA-8 system. And 61 Mechanized Battalion captured, there's a badge of 61 Mech there, they captured the first ever SA-8 missile system that had ever been seen by NATO-type forces. South Africa wasn't part of NATO, but it was in our hands, and it was handed over to friendly powers in time for the Gulf War. So these are important little nuances that people don't realize.
This is Russian, is it? Is it Russian?
It was a Russian piece of equipment. It was left lying on the battlefield, captured by Charlie Squadron and handed over to 3-2 Battalion, who then pulled it out intact. A Major Lehman, I think his name was, a farmer. He towed it out behind he knew how to get tractors started and whatever, and he found a tank, and he hot-wired a tank, and he towed this thing out behind a tank. But nonetheless, he got the honoris crux for that action. But the anti-colonial liberation struggle was nested in the Cold War. So the South African or Southern African region was all about the anti-colonial liberation struggle. And the best way to think about that is these Russian dolls. These Russian dolls where one doll's inside another. Think of the armed struggle in Southern Africa, not only South Africa, as a part of the Cold War. And of course, the big players there were Cuba and Russia. And most people here would not have had much to do with Cuba, but Cuba was a huge player in that part of the world. And Russia, of course, we all know about Russia. And they were players that supported those particular liberation movements. The ANC, South African Communist Party in South Africa, Frelimo in Mozambique, SWAPO in Namibia, ZAPU in Zimbabwe, and MPLA in Angola. So there was that sort of cleavage line that was very important throughout this thing. China was in the background, not as a very big player, but they were in the background. And I will try and tease out their significance going forward now. Because China supported in Zimbabwe ZANU, and they also supported the Pan-Africanist Congress. But the Pan-Africanist Congress was a very, very fractured and fragmented organization, and most of the PAC members didn't want to have any relationship with China, but there was a faction within PAC that wanted that relationship. So it's a very, very nuanced conversation when it comes to the PAC. So the important thing is that the region was awash with military hardware, absolutely awash. You could buy an AK-47 for $20. And you could get them into the mainstream of South Africa. And we eventually got involved in a very special operation, one of the pivotal operations, to map out the flow of illegal weapons. And I was involved in that operation called Operation Bush Talk, and I'll talk about that later on. So with this region awash with military hardware, let's just give you a little bit of background now. That's a map of Southern Africa. I'm not going to go into all the details here. I just want you to be aware of, that's Southern Africa there. And we had different parts of Southern Africa. Lusophone Africa, the Portuguese-speaking part of Southern Africa, was one theater. That was Angola and Mozambique. And there's Angola. You had 3 different liberation movements all over the country. And they were all fighting for liberation from Portugal. And a thing happened in Portugal in 1975, the Carnation Revolution. Suddenly there was a military takeover of the Portuguese government, and all of a sudden the Portuguese withdrew, leaving 3 warring factions that were all fighting for independence, and suddenly they turned on each other. So that's what happened in that part of Lusophone Africa. But the other one was in Mozambique. In Mozambique, there was only one organization, Frelimo. They were very, very far from capturing the capital city. Portugal turned around, walked out, left them, said, you form your own government. And that, of course, immediately created a significantly chaotic position. And, of course, they are very close to South Africa. It's maybe 400-500 kilometers from Maputo, the capital of Mozambique, to Pretoria, the capital of South Africa. So suddenly this second front was opened up now in South Africa, and that was of great importance. Then you had Anglophone Africa, and that is a very different place. So you had Rhodesia. Rhodesia was caught right in the middle. We have members here. I have a senior officer here from one of the Rhodesian security forces that we're going to talk about an operation that he was actually a leader of. But Rhodesia caught in the middle, and there you had two factions. You had two liberation movements, ZANU and ZAPU. One was backed by China, other backed by Russia. And the important thing is one of them had managed to liberate parts of the country in the sense that they could infiltrate enough forces into the country to create what they called liberated areas. So the government was trying their best now to exert their authority in those areas, and all of a sudden, bingo, believe it or not, the Lucifer in Africa changes, and a second front is opened up on the Eastern Highlands. And that second front made the Rhodesian war technically almost unwinnable at that moment in time. As sad as it is, it was a very, very difficult thing to turn that war around now. Then into the mix, you've got South Africa down at the bottom there. South Africa had two different liberation movements, the Pan-African Congress and the African National Congress. I'll talk about them later on. And they were not particularly well organized like the other liberation movements in Southern Africa. And all of a sudden, things started happening and they started to mobilize. But you'll notice that Southwest Africa, now known as Namibia, had only one liberation movement, SWAPO. And the significance of SWAPO was they were recognized by the United Nations as the sole representative of the people of Namibia. So there was always a strong bias in favor of SWAPO. And of course, that bias meant that South Africa was always the whipping boy. South Africa was always the out. There was always the dog. And that became very significant because there are a couple of stereotypes that have grown out of that, and I will deal with those stereotypes now. But then, overnight, things change. And to understand the significance of the change, you need to understand these two small countries, Lesotho, and there's Lesotho there, and Swaziland, both completely surrounded by other countries, landlocked countries, tiny postage stamp-sized countries, but of great strategic importance in terms of the liberation struggle. These became staging areas, jumping off points of transition for the guerrilla movement. And in the middle there, you'll see Botswana. Botswana was not alike. It was the Switzerland of Southern Africa. We didn't want anyone's nonsense around them. So any sort of freedom fighter that came their way, they would lock them up and send them home. Or no, they didn't want them. But now I'm going to show this. There's an arrow here. Okay, firstly, you need to understand there was this Russian ANC, SSCP, and ZAPU, the Zimbabwe African People's Union. They opened up a second front. I'll talk about that now. And Cuba was in the background. Cuba was more relevant to South Africa than it was to Rhodesia, but it was still a very, very big place. The Cubans were serious soldiers. They were serious fighters. They had serious capability. The Cubans were not a Mickey Mouse army by any stretch of imagination. Every South African veteran that I know has very deep and profound respect for the Cuban fighters they were up against. So now, I want you to look at that arrow there. That arrow is very important because that arrow was an attempt made by a combined force of ZAPU and MK. MK was the armed wing of the African National Congress, Mkhonto we Sizwe, Spear of the Nation, and they had this alliance with ZIPRA, the Zimbabwe People's Liberation Army, and this is a very, very important thing in the narrative I'm about to take forward. So we're not talking about threat perceptions. Threat perceptions are perceptions of reality. They're not necessarily a reality in their own right. It's a perception that the decision makers have of a reality. So it's about propaganda. It's about what is perceived to be true. And this gives rise to policy dilemmas. And I use the word dilemma very specifically because it's not a policy choice. It's not a binary option, this or that. Because it's based on a dilemma. A dilemma is something where all alternatives are equally unpleasant. That's why you sit on the horns of a dilemma. And there were two major policy dilemmas that I'm going to tease out now in the rest of this talk. So just please park the concept of a dilemma. So from a South African government perspective now, that we're talking now about the white minority government, the National Party government perspective. This is their perspective now. They had a binary policy dilemma of either shoot or settle. Do you win by having a superior military, or do you negotiate? And that was one of the important things that played its way out in South Africa for decades, certainly over my adult lifespan, shooting or settling. The shoot option was based on a strong paramilitary force. And by paramilitary, I mean not only army, I also mean police and militarized police. So there was a merging together. There was an overlapping of police and army, and this became very, very important later on when extrajudicial killings started to happen. So that paramilitary force was all based on this man here, P.W. Botha. You probably know him. He was known locally as the Groot Crocodile, or the Big Crocodile. He was a no-nonsense man. He was the former Minister of Defence when South Africa became independent from Britain in 1961, and he believed he built up the army. And if you want to understand the rhetoric of that period of time compared to temporary modern world, listen no further than Donald Trump talking about the might of the United States military exerting force. Because they're the most powerful military, they can do whatever they want to in the Gulf or anywhere else. So there's a very strong parallel between that. They were known as the Hawks, and they saw power as might. And the English language doesn't give us enough nuance to understand that fully. So in all of my writing, I've done a lot of writing about the subject. I use the French word of puissance. Puissance, power, the power as might, power as an electrical engineer, that's the power of megawatts and amps. Okay, you know, it's about the more vuma you got, the more power you got behind you, you know, the more you can do. And in fact, it's captured by this lovely Latin phrase here, cuius testiculus habeus cardio cerebellum, which means, and I will translate roughly, if you have them by their testicles, their hearts and minds will follow. So the Latin bit sort of, you know, smooths it over, but that's what it was all about. Now, the settled policy option was predicated on a competent civilian intelligence service, and it was based on a different view of power, the power of persuasion, the power of sitting down and talking, the power of settling disputes by peaceful means. So it was sort of a bit of a soft approach, and the doves were seen as sissies in the eyes of the hawks. And still to this day, there's still that tension that plays out. So the French word for that is pouvoir, and if you know French, is a very seductive language. So if you think of that Latin phrase there about if you've got them by the testicles, this is more about playing with their testicles and making them enjoy the ride. Okay. So that was the separation. It's not selling out to the enemy; it's understanding the enemy, sitting down. But you know, what about this and what about that? And do you mean this? And have you seen this point of view? Okay. So the armed struggle saw cooperation between two major forces. In South Africa, it was Mkhonto Wesizwe. There were other forces as well, but MK was the major premier one, and then the other one was ZIPRA in Zimbabwe. And that arrow that I showed you on the previous slide was an infiltration, the first ever infiltration of a combined detachment called the Luthuli detachment. And that gentleman there in that row, he was the commanding officer of the regiment that brought those people to contact. He was in the front line of that action. So he knows all about what happened at that particular event. And that the Luthuli detachment had as an objective the opening up of the Ho Chi Minh Trail into South Africa. The MK had a very close relationship with the war in Vietnam. There was always, you know, back and forth, and a certain General Giap gave them advice. If you want to win this war, you've got to have your Ho Chi Minh Trail. You've got to have your logistics trail. If you don't have your logistics trail, you can't fight the war. So there were 5 attempts made to open that logistics trail, and all of them failed. 3 of them went through Zimbabwe, and then 2 of them went through Mozambique. They all were brought to contact. They all failed. And there was eventually, believe it or not, planning on the table to land an expeditionary force in the Transkei area. By amphibious means. In other words, think of the Marines coming ashore. There was that kind of planning put in place, and most people in the military were unaware of that. Now it gets interesting, because ZIPRA, after joining this struggle with the MK, they downed 2 Air aircraft, killing all passengers on board. And this is where it gets very interesting, because this created a dominant threat perception in the region that you cannot negotiate with terrorists. This is an act of terrorism. You can't just shoot down a civilian aircraft, and then in case that was a mistake, you shoot down a second one just to make sure, and then nobody condemns it. The fact that it's not condemned, this is what fed into that mindset, a very strong dominant mindset. And that mindset I'm going to show you some graphic images now. I'm going to just whip through them very quickly. But the threat perception was you don't negotiate with terrorists. And these are some of the images. This was a book written by an SAS soldier, one of the first guy to hit the ground when the first of these aircraft crashed. It was in 1978, if my memory serves me correctly. And he wrote literally a first person's perspective of what it looked like on the ground. And then a year later, there was a second one. So it wasn't a mistake. The first one wasn't just an accidental discharge. It was a deliberate strategy. And the second one now, the engine was shot out. In fact, here's the image here. I saw that on Facebook just about 2 weeks ago. So that the engine was shot out. The aircraft was still flying. The pilot miraculously managed to land. There were some people on board killed. About half of the people were killed or severely injured, and a few people were managed to walk. They walked out of there to go and get help, and they left the injured people behind. And in the process, they were set upon by zipper forces and bayoneted to death. And that became an absolutely heinous crime. And that's the monument in South Africa to those two events. You'll see the dates there, and you'll also see the number of survivors and what have you. But the 5 years later, 5 years after the first event, there was a horrific car bomb planted in Johannesburg, in Pretoria, outside military intelligence headquarters. One of our members here, his wife narrowly escaped death on that particular day. So that's, once again, these are felt very closely. A colleague of mine, a good friend of mine, was a dog handler there, and he spoke about coming out of the building after the bomb blast, and he was a first responder, and he looked up to these high-rise buildings, and he spoke about the fact that the eyes of the city had gone dead, because the eyes were no longer reflecting sunlight. All the glass was gone. And he spoke about how his dog was walking around, sniffing out the body parts and what have you, and every now and then the dog would lift up its foot. It had a shard of glass or a piece of metal stuck in its foot, and he would pull that shard out, and they just carried on. And the important thing is that was never, ever condemned. It was never condemned. And this became a very, very, almost a shocking moment for South Africa. But it was not without international support. And this is a man, a Dutch man, who's got a very, very famous history in South Africa. His name is Klaus de Jonge. He was arrested for his role in that particular event. He managed to escape police custody, and he then found his way into the Dutch embassy in Pretoria. And you've had one of your own citizens find his way into an embassy somewhere, so you know how messy it gets once someone ends up in an embassy. And he was eventually released as part of the negotiations, the peace negotiations. But there was another unfortunate individual, and I'm going to show you a photograph now, a woman. Her name is Helena Pastoors, a Belgian woman, and she was part of this bombing incident. She was responsible for bringing parts of the explosive device across international borders, and she was arrested. She was imprisoned, and she was also subsequently released. And to the best of my knowledge, she's still alive, but Klaus de Jonge is no longer with us. So that's it just shows that the battle lines were hardened. There was no give or take. That car bomb, I might add, was the biggest car bomb in South Africa until then. Towards the end, just before the elections, there was an even bigger car bomb that was detonated by the white right. And the difference with the white right is that they were mostly miners, and they had access to Amfex and Metafex, so military mining grade explosives. So they boosted their device. So the white right was even more violent than this particular group of people. So the settle, going back now, that's just setting the scene. I want to talk about the concept now of hydro diplomacy that most of you have never probably heard about. How do you become diplomatic in the water space? And that's my sort of little field of expertise. So the settled policy option was initially preferred by John Foster, who was the Prime Minister. And there's a little bit of background just to sort of help you to understand it. The Pan-Africanist Congress, one of the liberation movements, broke away from the African National Congress in the late 50s, early 60s. And they broke away over the issue of violence. The ANC at that point in time was guided by Mahatma Gandhi, a famous Indian activist. And Mahatma Gandhi developed this concept of passive resistance. And Mahatma Gandhi himself was a stretcher bearer during the Anglo-Boer War. So he knew exactly what it's like to bring dismembered bodies off the battlefield. And he believed that passive resistance was the way to go. India got its independence as a result of that. But nonetheless, the PAC said, no, this is not to be. They want to go onto the offensive. And they broke away and they started that group, Apartheid, which is their armed wing. It means spark or pure. And they went immediately onto the offensive. As a result of that, they planned a thing called the Night of Death. And they were not particularly well organized as a liberation movement, but the strategy was around the Night of Death that a few hundred of their cadres would rise up as one, and they would attack targets that were racially defined. And our security forces got wind of that. They were based in Lesotho. These people were operating out of Lesotho. And our security forces got wind of that. And when these poorly organized organizations try and organize themselves, the first thing that they do is develop a list of members. How many members have we got? And of course, the police got access to that list. And because they had access to that list, they were wrapped up like overnight, and 2,000 people were arrested almost overnight. But the police, having foreknowledge of this now, they briefed Prime Minister Foster. And Prime Minister Foster, you've got to understand, was an Afrikaner nationalist. He had a long history. I can't go into it all now. We don't have time enough to do it. But he wanted to portray the white Afrikaner Boer people as Africans that had fought a war of liberation against Britain, and that they were legitimate Africans. The name Afrikaner means that I'm an African. So they saw themselves as Africans, and they saw their ideology is not very different from the African National Congress's ideology. It was a form of nationalism. And so Foster was really trying his best now to position South Africa as a responsible country. And he had a meeting with Prime Minister Leo Boer Jonathan, who was the Prime Minister of Lesotho at that time. Lesotho had just got its independence from Britain as well. So two newly independent countries, the heads of state spoke to each other, and they spoke to each other about this Night of Death thing. And Foster said to him, "Listen, Mr. Prime Minister, we don't like what's happening here. Let's talk about it." And he offered a thing that became known as the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. I don't know if you know about that, but Lesotho Highlands Water Project was a gift. So it's something like the Snowy Mountain Water Project. Just the relevance of the Snowy Mountain to Australia as the foundation of the Australian modern economy is as significant as this particular project. It's a massive, massive hydropower and water diversion project in the mountains of Lesotho. And it was originally designed for the gold mining industry, but Foster said, let's turn it into a national peacemaking initiative. And there is a condition, and the condition is that you cannot have guerrilla fighters on your territory, and we will reciprocate. So it was a reciprocal diplomatic exchange. And the PAC was then forced to leave Lesotho in about 1965, and they were a little bit bitter and twisted about that. They went up to Tanzania, and they continued fighting from there. But Foster Day Stunt Initiative floated an idea of a regional economic cooperation with security as its objective, and that eventually became what is today known as SADC, the Southern African Development Community. But SADC grew as a response against the South African initiative. So that, I don't want to get sidetracked into that conversation, but just understand that the idea of regional economic integration as a peacekeeping mechanism, similar to the European Union, with security as an objective. There was a belief that diplomacy would triumph, and so the second South African Hydraulic Mission was born. And if you're interested in this stuff, I'm doing a lot of Substack podcasts at the moment, and I'm doing a series of podcasts on the South African Hydraulic Mission, and I'm trying to draw parallels to the Australian Hydraulic Mission, because there's a lot of parallels in that regard. So the Hydraulic Mission is born, and you start seeing major projects like the Lesotho Highlands Water Project. You start seeing the Cahora Bassa Hydroelectric Project in Mozambique, and you start seeing the Kalawick Hydropower Project in Angola and Namibia. Right, now we get into some messy detail. I see Brendan looking at his watch. I hope we're not running too much out of time here. Okay, so this is a map that shows the acts of violence over a period of time. And this is the Pan-Africanist Congress. And you'll see on the left-hand side, from 1961 to 1964, at the bottom there, that was the Night of Death campaign. So the important thing to note there is that there were 2,000 members that were arrested because their name was on a list. And note there, for 25 years, there was peace. 25 years. So these people identified, they're taken out, they're arrested, and 25 years of peace. That's a pretty good peace dividend. And then all of a sudden, blow me down with a feather, we start talking about reconciliation, we start talking about constitutional reform, and they say that we don't want any of this. And they say no, and they go onto the offensive. They rebrand themselves from Poko. They rebrand themselves now as APLA, the Zanzian People's Liberation Army, and they go onto the offensive. They say, no, we don't want any peace talks, because peace talks imply we recognize the government as being part of a colonial regime. We don't recognize any form of colonialism. They're profoundly anti-colonial in their vision. So they launched now a new thing called the Great Storm Campaign, and I'll just quickly touch on some of the things of the Great Storm Campaign. You see, for example, in 1992, an attack in King Williamstown. It's a small little town. Something like, what's that town we go and have? York, something like York, a town, something like that. And they rise up and they go and they hit people having a beer and a hamburger at this place, and it's just utter carnage. And then they go on a rampage in 1993. And they start hitting various places. The most significant one was a church. The St. James Church massacre, it was called eventually. Worshippers sitting in a church, and gunmen walk in with, at this stage they had Kalashnikovs, they walk in with Kalashnikov assault rifles, and they opened fire, and then they tossed in a few hand grenades for good measure. So there was that, and then there was another thing in Cape Town, in Heidelberg Tavern. It's a pub where people were attacked, and then in East London at the Highgate Hotel. I don't know, people here from East London, they might remember that Highgate Hotel incident. So they were particularly violent, but they were not militarily sophisticated. They were not militarily complex. It was just these were just acts of violence without any real military movement and strategy and tactic behind it. But this is the real significance here now, is that's when the Cadessa period happened, from 1990 to 1994. Cadessa was the Convention for a Democratic South Africa. That's when the negotiations happened, and you'll see there's an uptick in violence from them, because they rejected this peace process. But then it gets really interesting at the end there. You'll see that in 1999, some APLA soldiers that were taken up into the South African National Defence Force chose to reject. There were still some white people in the army, and they chose to frag. What's known as fragging, when a junior person throws a hand grenade into a tent where your senior guy sits, and it's an incident. Sorry, you forgot fragged. The hand grenade went off. So there was this fragging incident, and 7 white soldiers were murdered, and this one APLA guy was taken into custody. So they've always been very, very difficult people to deal with, because they just didn't want to know this talk about peace. So it's not only a white South African thing where people were divided over the shoot versus settle. Now, during this early period of time, while the PAC is doing their thing, and while those aircraft that were shot down feed into the public psyche, you start getting the shoot policy option really starts taking hold by the Minister of Defence, P.W. Botha. You start seeing massive parades like this in South Africa. All of the Savoy guys at some stage participated in a parade like that. I was given the freedom of Johannesburg at one point in time. I've got a little certificate somewhere. So those are all shows of force. And the Doves were sort of in control in the intelligence service in a thing called BOSS, the Bureau of State Security. And they were asked in a thing called the info scandal, and I haven't got time to talk about the info scandal. You're welcome to ask questions later on if you want to. But P.W. Botha becomes Prime Minister as a result of the info scandal, and he entrenches the shoot policy option. And not only does he entrench the shoot policy option, they create an environment of paranoia and fear. This absolute environment, a polarized environment. Once again, think of the Donald Trump thing today. Polarized. It's about migrants. It's about this. It's about that. That polarized view of paranoia and fear. And this was called the rooi gevaar, or the red danger, the red peril. And this is the image of the red peril. So that red peril thing was bandied around everywhere. So whenever I talk about the red peril, I'll show you that image now, because it comes up more from this moment onwards. The South African Defence Force enters into Angola, and now I'm going to say something that is of surprise to some people. They enter into Angola after the betrayal by the CIA at a place called Kifangondo. Kifongondo, north of Luanda. The CIA betrayed the South African Defence Force. They left an artillery, a battery up the creek without a paddle. And this CIA betrayal was not taken well by P.W. Botha, who was at that stage the Minister of Defence and later became the Prime Minister. So the CIA betrayal became a dagger into the heart of South Africa. And there's a myth that's been perpetuated to this day that South Africa was a proxy force for America. I'm here to tell you it never was like that. And I'm going to tell you, I'm going to give you more evidence as we go along. So SADF now, after Operation Savannah, that incursion into Angola, the SADF modernizes and they become nuclear capable. So this nuclear stuff, the South African Burkis, they can do stuff. When their backs to the wall, they can fight. They can fight. And these guys now become nuclear capable, and they launch a chemical and biological and nuclear program, CBN program, called Project Coast. And that was a world-class program. If you love these weapons of mass destruction, I'm opposed to those things, but it was a very significant program. And the name there of the Vostrap test site, that's an airport near Uppington in the Kalahari area. And you're going to see the relevance of that later on the next slide. So the total national strategy, you mentioned the total national strategy. The total national strategy was an official government approach designed to bring all segments of society, including the manufacturing capability, the manufacture of specialist steels to make gun barrels, the manufacture of specialist engines and gearboxes and electronic stuff, and to eventually create missiles and create all of the things that you see happening now today in the Middle East. And so this total strategy, national strategy was born from 3 American betrayals. I can't mention all 3 now, it's just too long, but there were 3. In fact, there was even a 4th American betrayal, but the 3 significant American betrayals that each one just drove the dagger in deeper into the South African decision maker's heart. Not society, but I'm talking about the elite. So South Africa was never part and parcel to this thing. And I'll show you. I refer back to that earlier image of the Battle of the Lomba, with that capture of that equipment, that SA-8. The Americans wanted that thing with a sore heart. And the South African government said, no, remember these betrayals. You're not going to get it from us. And the South Africans gave it to another third party, knowing it would go to the Americans, but from a diplomatic point of view, it could not go to the Americans directly. So that's an important thing. But sanctions started to bite at this stage, and South Africa became a pariah state with very limited diplomatic presence. So without a diplomatic presence, how do you engage with other countries? And this is where the intelligence service starts playing a role now. But in this background of paranoia and red peril, an order is given to create a thing called Project Duel. Project Duel, most of you would not have heard about. The purpose of Project Duel was to eliminate own forces who had become a security risk by engaging with the enemy. Now, us in National Intelligence Service, we were engaging with the enemy. That's what we were doing, and we were own forces. So we fell fairly and squarely in the crosshairs of Project Duel. And a large portion of my life and the life of my family that now lives in Australia is as a result of living in the shadow of the death squads from Project Duel. And the reason why we can talk about that now is because this has been the subject of lots and lots of work at the Truth Commission. The TRC has done a huge amount of work. You can Google Project Duel. There's a book called Death Flight that was about Project Duel. So a lot of that is available now, and it's quite cathartic to talk about it. But extrajudicial killing started, and South Africa became a killing machine. And we often hear about the third force. But South Africa was literally a killing machine, a very sophisticated killing machine. And this extrajudicial killing was very quiet in the background. One of the first murders that we became aware of, the first assassinations, was a guy called Smit, Dr. Smit, Nico Smit. He was a very senior National Party official. He was an economist that was seconded to the IMF in Washington. And he came home, evidently with some evidence in his pocket, who knows, and he was assassinated. Him and his wife were assassinated. And that became the first assassination of many. And those assassinations, for example, included Olof Palme in Sweden. So it was not just local stuff, it was all happening, and these things have never been solved. Dulcie September, ANC representative in Paris, Godfrey Motsepe in Brussels, attempt was made on his life, and he managed to survive that. So there was all of these extrajudicial things happening. But then they made a mistake. They decided with the chemical, biological, and nuclear program, they started developing poisons, toxins, and they decided to poison South Africans. And one of the famous poison cases now was this Reverend Frank Chikane, who is as significant as Archbishop Desmond Tutu. He was a member of the World Council of Churches, and he was on his way to a meeting in New York, I think it was, either New York or Canada, I think in New York. And he checked his luggage in at Johannesburg International Airport, so his luggage now goes into the system, and these guys get the luggage on the other side, and they doctor his underwear with organophosphate poison, in the belief that there's this thing about the testicles, that cruise testicles thing, the thing that is going to absorb now this organophosphate because it's a warm, moist, and friendly environment. And Frank Chikane on the other side now puts his underwear on, gets sick. It's taken up into hospital, and of course what they do now is they immediate forensic tests are done. What's caused this thing? And they find organophosphate poisoning, and they do what they have to do. They call the FBI in, and now you've got the big boys. These are the serious boys now they're not playing games. The FBI then is not the FBI now. They were very serious about this. So that suddenly internationalized this thing about extrajudicial killing. And for a long time now, almost like the Epstein files, are they there, aren't they there, who did what to who? This thing banded around South Africa for a decade, maybe longer. But the important thing is all doors were shut and diplomacy was dead. Now let's look at the ANC, African National Congress. So the ANC started, initially they were I would almost say they were drawn into the armed struggle by the PAC. Nelson Mandela at that stage was the head of the ANC Youth League. And they started from 1961 when we became independent from Britain until 1964, 65. There was this period of time where they launched this acts of sabotage. They weren't very well organized at that point in time. They didn't yet have their logistics networks going with their international arms suppliers. So the acts of sabotage were mostly of electrical power lines, these big pylons that were brought down, and they were often brought down by hacksaw. By somebody with a saw in his hand, cutting down the four legs and making this thing fall down, and big flash and lightning, and very impressive, and a large portion of the country suddenly without electricity. At that stage, they didn't yet have access to explosives and Kalashnikovs and stuff like that. So those early acts of sabotage were important, but it was the early phases of the armed struggle. Then there was this thing called the treason trial. The treason trial, I can't go into all the details here, but the attempt by the state to charge these people with treason, and then of course the legal guy said, but you can't charge the treason because treason's got a very precise definition, and these guys aren't acting in treason. So there was a back and forth, and investor confidence was lost. I'll show you the graph just now. So there was a lull. There was a period of lull, and eventually Nelson Mandela and Walter Sisulu, etc., were imprisoned on Robben Island, but they weren't given the death sentence. And I had the privilege in my life, in my professional life, of working with a prosecutor, a man called Percy Utah. Dr. Percy Utah. I worked very closely with Dr. Percy Utah in my professional life, and he gave me the inside story about why they deliberately did not go for the death penalty. A lot of things have been said out there about Percy Utah, but I've got it directly from his mouth. But now the important thing is from 1965 to 75, a decade. There's a decade of silence. Remember the PAC, there was 25 years of silence. So this is now becoming fast and furious. And now the year is 1980, and you'll see in the next slide we're going to talk about 1981. So 1980 becomes very, very important. And the first thing that happens is 1982, there's a bombing incident at the Koeberg nuclear power plant. Now this is the only nuclear power plant in the continent of Africa. It's governed by International Atomic Energy Agency rules. And that also became part of the nuclear program, because when a decision was made to not give South Africa fuel for this thing, they said, right, we'll create our own. And then that became the whole impetus to create weapons of mass destruction using nuclear weapons. But just think about this. a highly sensitive nuclear power station that is targeted. You've got to get into this thing. There's security around it. There are protocols and procedures. Joe Soap can't just walk in off the street and say, I want to walk around your plant. I want to look at your pumps and look at your reactors, you know. So these guys got in through all of those mechanisms. They managed to get inside. They did a reconnaissance. They drew plans, drew maps. They got photographs, and they exfiltrated, and they went back and said, right, we need this, we need explosive, we need that and that and that, and they then procured those things. These things came into the country, and then they said, right, we're going to put a team of people in, the explosives are now going to be delivered to site, this is where you're going to position them. We're talking about a level of sophistication here. And this level of sophistication was different to all the other stuff. And that, better believe it, got the attention of the people in power. And the next year, the very next year, we saw that car bomb being planted. So literally the very next year, this car bomb goes off, and now you've got the full attention. Boy, oh boy, if you wanted the attention now you've got them, okay? And this became part of the red peril, the red threat perception, and Project Dual came out of all of this thing here now. Now, on the next slide, I'm going to go back to 1981, which is just before this nuclear power plant, and I'll talk a bit about the red peril later on. But the important thing now is that the ANC's campaign, let's look at the timeline at the bottom there now. CODESA was 1990 to 1988 to 1994. So during the build-up to CODESA, there were all of these incidents. There you had, in 1 year alone, you had 231 incidents, including the Magoo's Bar bombing. The Magoo's Bar was a pub in Durban, a beachfront pub, and there was a bomber that came in. Let's look at the number of incidents firstly. So we're talking now about, 230 incidents? So that's 2 incidents every 3 days. So it's quite a lot of incidents. And the Magoo's Bar bomber, I'll mention him now. We then had this other incident now, an attack on the Magistrates Court in Johannesburg, also a bombing incident, and these were all violent use of military-grade high explosives, mostly SPM mini limpet mines that were brought in, across the border. And the person that led that Magoo's Bar bombing was a man called Robert McBride, and he was arrested. He was sentenced to death. And he got a stay of execution because of the negotiations that were going on. So he was never ever executed, and he was released along with all other political prisoners as part of the peacemaking process. So one of the bitter pills that was swallowed by various people that have lost family, friends, etc. in these incidents. It's not an easy thing for them to come to terms with. And what happened to Mr. McBride? Well, he goes on from being this hero to eventually becoming the chief of police in Ekurhuleni. That's the metro where Johannesburg International Airport is. And he then goes on to become the head of IPID, the Independent Police Investigations Directorate. So these are the guys that police the police. These are the guys that make sure that the police don't break any law. And lo and behold, I'm not going to ask if anyone here is from ASIO, but lo and behold, he's now the head of the foreign division of the South African Security Agency, the intelligence service. So if ASIO does have any liaison, I'm not saying they do, if they have any liaison with these guys, he's the man you're going to talk to. He's the man at the other side of the table. So this is part and parcel of the price you pay for reconciliation. So that's when CODESA was happening. Okay, now we get into the interesting stuff. Now this is hors d'oeuvre. The settled policy option is not fashionable at all. Randy, I see you looking at your watch. I will speed up. I might just add my Zulu name. My Zulu name is Khawuleza. Khawuleza, I see there was an African here who knows what Khawuleza means. Khawuleza means to always be in a hurry. So that's my Zulu name, and I'm trying desperately not to be in a hurry. Okay, but the important thing now is that the settled policy option was always preferred by the civilian intelligence service. So it was in their DNA, it was even hardwired into their processes and procedures. And Dr. Neil Barnard, my boss, was appointed. He was an academic professor. He was a professor of political science at University of Free State, and he was appointed nobody. I mean, he was very unknown as a public figure, and he was appointed to head the National Intelligence Service after this trauma of this that info scandal, and he was appointed at a time at the very start of the MK bombings. So the first thing that he did now was he started developing an analytical capacity. Because up until then, the intelligence services lacked an analytical capacity. So what happened now is an incident would happen there, it would be reported, and a politician immediately would go and flip a switch and say he'll send the troops in, or send an aircraft carrier to the Straits of Hormuz or whatever. The important thing is there was no mediation. There was no time to cool down, no time to think about it, and no time to get a second opinion. So he brought that in, and he hardwired it into the system. And he hardwired it through a diplomatic exchange that took place, a thing called the Simonstown Agreement. And the Simonstown Agreement made certain that all intelligence in South Africa is routed through National Intelligence Service, and they alone provide the National Intelligence Estimate, the NIE. Therefore, the police and the army and everyone else is obliged to send their intelligence to National Intelligence. They process it, they integrate it, they check it out, they validate it, do fact-checking and all this kind of stuff. And they just put a little bit of a time delay fuse into that explosive device. So now they start analysing these MK bombings and what have you, and they start coming up to some very interesting internal conversations that I'm now going to give you insight into. So the first thing that Barnard says now, he says, well, he builds this diplomatic liaison service to service because we don't have all these missions out there, but he redefines the core mission, and he brings his top leadership structure in, the executives, and says, what is our core business? What do we actually do? And of course, at that point in time, it was a state security paradigm. And he said, if you're going to secure a state from its own citizens, it implies that your government is illegitimate. Therefore, the solution to that problem is to legitimize the government through constitutional reform. Bah! Bingo! And that becomes the moment. At that stage, I'm out in the bushes fighting a war as an armored soldier, now turned an internal infantryman in the townships of the East Rand, and suddenly I feel this attractive force. I feel this magnetic attraction, because I see the fighting in the townships is not going in the direction it should be, and I see that we are on our way to hiding here, and I'm immediately attracted to that intellectual thinking about this thing. So the important thing is that democracy was conceived in vitro. It was an in vitro conception. It was in bottles, in glass, an in vitro conception in the early 1980s. And it required a surrogate mother to take to full term. And that's the important take-home message today, because it took almost a decade for that surrogate mother to be found. And that surrogate mother was in the form of CODESA, the Convention for Democratic South Africa. But now, I mentioned earlier on, I'm going to talk about 1981. Lo and behold, blow me down with a feather. And what happens? We capture a Russian spy. Not the first Russian spy, there are a bunch of Russian spies, but we capture a Russian spy. And this man is a very important one. His name is Alexei Kozlov. And he gets captured and he gets debriefed. You debrief these people. So he gets debriefed and spoken to and blah, blah, fish paste and hanakiri. And there's a postage stamp in Russia to this day for Alexei Kozlov. So he's a famous Russian spy because he was released. He was released in a spy swap. So we've got this spy, high-value spy, and we don't know what to do with him. We've debriefed him, but we don't know what to do. The best we've got is we've got a South African national serviceman that's been captured called Sapper van der Mest. He's an ordinary little guy, came out of school, he was a sapper, and he did something that he shouldn't do. He walked out of a camp, and he was captured by SWAPO, and we couldn't get him back. 6-1 Mex were sent to go and get him back. No one could get him back. So he's out there, and the decision was made, we're going to swap this high-value spy for a conscripted soldier. For the family of that soldier, it's very important, but in terms of state domain, this is not you're not getting like for like. It's not an apple for apple. So word gets out amongst the other intelligence services, and oh, no, wait a second, they've got assets that the Russians are controlling now as well. Will we please combine these things and do a joint spy swap? So by all means, come along. We'll do a joint spy swap. So I won't mention the names of the services, but they said, right, we've got a list of people, boom, 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 boom. We want them also to be released. And then to sweeten the deal for South Africa, we are going to give you access to technology you've never had before. And to a South African, technology is an amazing thing. They love it. They just love it. And this technology was satellite interception technology. So in one fell swoop, Pretoria was given the capacity to listen to every single telephone conversation from Lusaka to London, from Samafco in Tanzania. Every single telephone conversation was listened to. And in those days, as an agent handler, I was working on certain targets. ANC SSCP was my target. And I would get every single day intercepts, like kilograms of printed paper intercepts, stating who'd phoned who, from which department, what they said, in the last 24 hours. So it became such a mess that we couldn't actually deal with it. It was just an overload of the stuff. So that electronic surveillance was part of it. And this paved the way, a very important thing, because we dealt service to service. So NIS to KGB. And that became a very important channel that was later on exploited, and that paved the way for the head of the NIS to meet with Mikhail Gorbachev in 1991. And that meeting, remember, 1981, that was just before that bomb went off in the Kuburg nuclear site. And if you look on that postage stamp now, you'll see that little picture there, that's Fostrup. That's the nuclear device at Fostrup. So Kozlov's role was to do the spying work to find out what South Africa was doing about the nuclear program. Okay. Now the Doves go onto the offensive. So you've got the background now. There's this Operation Jewel, Project Jewel has been launched, and the chief directed covert operations. My wife was very unhappy tonight that I wore this badge because she said I must wear a formal belt, and I said I'm representing these boys tonight, so I've got to wear their insignia. So the Faceless Few, they were known as, and they were created in 1986. They were created at the same time that another institution was created, the CCB, the Civil Cooperation Bureau. And if you Google Civil Cooperation Bureau, you'll find all the hit squads activities and all of this bad stuff was in the CCB. So these two forces now face themselves off. The CDCO becomes a special purpose vehicle, and the purpose of that was to get the operators to enable them to talk to the enemy in peace so that they wouldn't be assassinated, that the enemy would not be assassinated, and to start figuring out if we can have a peaceful transition to democracy. And that was the Faceless Few. And that Neil Barnard, in his books, he talks about the top end of that. I'm talking about what is under the surface now of this floating iceberg. The CCB was responsible for extrajudicial killing, and this became more and more evident as time went by, as Project Duel and Project Coast became evident, became investigated by all sorts of commissions of inquiry. And the CDCO made a call on the collapse of communism. Now, I want you to picture what I'm about to say now. We're sitting in a secret covert meeting place, in a covert office, somewhere. In fact, I'll tell you where it was. We were overlooking the banks of Verwoerdburg, Lake Centurion in Pretoria. So we're in this commercial office overlooking Lake Centurion, and at that point in time, CNN had just come out. So here, for the first time, we saw CNN now beaming images into your space in real time. And we were talking from an intelligence perspective, how long it takes to get your spy trained. You've got to recruit them, you've got to train them, you've got to infiltrate them, get passports, get all this kind of stuff, get communications going. And you send a message to them, encrypt it, and then they decrypt it, and they answer your message, and 2 weeks later, you might get an answer. And then, lo and behold, an image comes up on the screen. That image there. And I sit there, well, we all sit, we gobsmacked at what we are seeing. We see a man standing in front of a column of tanks at a place called Tiananmen Square. And the light bulb moment goes on. Bah! Intelligence. We don't need these spies. We can use CNN. We can use this stuff, we can use real time. And this is an absolute pivotal moment. Because now the question starts, people are asking questions now. So if citizens can stand up to tanks in China and not get crushed, what is the future of communism? Has communism run its natural lifespan? Is communism now going to crash down around our ears under the weight of its own inherent contradiction? And if communism is collapsing, now the big thing is, will the USSR continue to exist? Can they keep it together? Yes or no? And bingo. If not, then what are the chances for a negotiated constitutional reform without interference by the Russians? And what do we need to do to support track to diplomacy? And with that, Operation Flare is born, and I will talk about Operation Flare now. And in that moment, a decision gets made, and I get sent out to Europe, and I get sent to go and verify what's happening in the USSR. And I find myself, of all places, I find myself in East Berlin in December 1989, when the wall comes down. And I gave a talk of that. The videographer captured that talk a while ago. So if you're interested in that, we'll try and send you both links, and you can look at that. I'm not going to talk about that now, but nonetheless. So in that moment, wow, just like it's a light bulb moment. What's going to happen now? So right, what is Operation Flare? This graph shows a very sad story about South Africa. On the vertical axis, you've got values from 0 in the middle to plus 40 on the top and minus 40 on the bottom. And that represents foreign direct investment as a percentage of GDP in the country. And you'll see this here. See that big thing there? That was the treason trial period. The treason trial, all the harakiri about the treason trial and loss of investor confidence. So we knew about this stuff. And then when the treason trial didn't happen, then suddenly confidence came back. And the important thing to note now are these following, because I can speak for hours on this graph. I'll just give you the highlights. So the highlights as follows. In 1985, it went from positive to negative. And that happened at a moment in time when South Africa became technically bankrupt. We were unable to afford the various military missions. We were unable to afford the development of nuclear programs. We were unable to afford all the weapons that we were making, the very sophisticated weapons that we were making, and that became a very important moment. So the purpose of Operation Flare was to try and turn that trajectory around. And you'll see there that dotted line gives the trajectory, and you'll notice that confidence was only returned. If you look at the top of the graph, those are the heads of state at the different moments in time. It only turned positive. In other words, we started getting foreign direct investment back into the country at the end of Nelson Mandela's term of office. So Thabo Mbeki was the guy that turned it around. And Thabo Mbeki did a fairly good job, and then Motlana did a fairly good job, and then Jacob Zuma came in and took over. And then from Jacob Zuma, it went south. It went south very fast. And that was 2013, where an important event happened, a thing called the Marikana massacre. Marikana was a mining incident, and it was about Cyril Ramaphosa. Unfortunately, he was a director of one of the mining operations at the time. And a lot of investigation into the role he played in this, but the police were called out against striking miners, and there were shots fired exactly as Sharpeville happened in 1960-61. Exactly. So the Sharpeville was to the National Party government what Marikana became to the ANC. So you've got mirror images of the same thing playing out here now. And from there it goes into net negative. Now the question is, look at this now. So it's currently net negative 30. I don't know if it's turning around, because I haven't got the latest information. The guy that drew this data up for me is unfortunately no longer with us. He passed away a while ago, Mike Schisler. And look at this now. That's Operation Flare. That's how Operation Flare turned that trajectory around. And we'll talk about Flare now. But the question to ask is, with net negative 5% brought about regime change in the government with the most powerful military on the continent of Africa, what will net negative 30 do? That's a question. And the other question now, in the context of the contemporary world, because you've got a big, powerful military, does might equal right. Doesn't mean to say that you can just drop a few bombs on people and they're going to capitulate and you're going to get a whole new, better world. So these are important parallel things to discuss. Right, we're now on a steep learning curve, and I'm going to accelerate it from now. Kawalaz is going to kick in now. There was a thing called the car safari, because now we're in business. The chief director's been created. We've got our offices. We've got our logo. We're out there doing business now. We go to work every day, and we make sure there's no bombs in our car. Make sure that when we put the key in the ignition, it's all going to work. No explosive devices going to take us out. Train all the kids that when they go to school now, they must be careful of this, that, and the next thing. And we now decide we've got to take this thing out of the secret domain into the public domain. And that becomes this thing called the Dakar Safari. And the Dakar Safari was an initiative run by CDCO and was designed to test public opinion about a negotiated ending to the armed struggle. And as luck would have it, the media, conservative media, was scathing. They hated it. They were completely against this. This bunch of sissies talking about making peace with the enemy here. They were scathing. And this front page article came out, "The Dumb Doctors of Dakar." And what's interesting, if you look at that now, our intelligence processes were becoming sophisticated and deeply informed. You saw the previous graph that was informing all of our decisions. Where we knew that South Africa was a fundamentally capital-constrained economy, and that has security implications. And the army was just going on as if there was no tomorrow. They were just buying tanks and fighter aircraft and doing whatever they wanted to do. But look at that headline on the bottom left there. There it says, "Despite disinvestment and sanctions, boycotts, money flows into South Africa." Now, I will suggest to you that was an exaggeration. Okay, money was not flowing into South Africa. In fact, had Flair not happened, it was continued to flow out, and we would have collapsed even sooner. So we knew about that stuff, but now it gets interesting. Always gets interesting. While this is happening out there, and the newspapers are chasing around and journalists are chasing around the dumb doctors of Dakar, there's a secret meeting taking place with Nelson Rolihlahla Mandela, Madiba. And that secret meeting is covered up by this public ruckus that's happening out there. And I'll show you about that now. But in the background, I'm going to mention something that is not widely known. There was an operation running from NIS called Operation Cruiser. And Operation Cruiser was, in my professional opinion, as significant to South Africa as Operation Ultra was in World War II. And if you know anything about World War II history, Operation Ultra was the cracking of the German Enigma code. So we cracked their code within MK, and we read everything. We got all the messages, all the minutes of the meetings, with all the deployments, how many people were coming, what they were carrying, where they were going to cross the border, all of that stuff from inside MK. So Cruiser became a critically important part of this whole negotiation thing. As I say, they didn't know about it. And then coming out of that was Operations Hardekool and Spaghetti. And in my book, you'll see there's some photographs of Operation Hardekool, where one of the gadgets was discovered in Hardekool, and Spaghetti was about getting into the heads of the Communist Party in their places of safety, wherever they were in their place of safety. So we were reading their heads as well. And one of the guys, a guy called Harold Wolpe, discovered a device in his house. And this became a debate in the House of Commons. And it was very embarrassing because it came to our attention that the street that Harold Wolpe was living in was under surveillance by the anti-terrorist squad in Britain. And we didn't know that, because had we known that, we wouldn't have done what we did. But nonetheless, we didn't know it, so we did what we did, and we apologised to the British intelligence people through private channels, because believe it or not, Maggie Thatcher was not happy. Okay, so the big lessons that came out of this, there was an era of initiatives, about 5 or 6 initiatives. Mel's Park initiative was one of them. There was a whole bunch of these things. Mel's Park was driven by the mining industry and the banking industry. They were big guys that were interested in the outcome. And we learned then how to interpret the actions of the hidden hand, because all of these things had foreign governments behind them. So what were the foreign government's interests in those outcomes? That is our job to decipher. And the most important question for anyone interested in this stuff now is form follows function. So we didn't have to create any of this stuff. This stuff was being created in the Petri dish on its own. This Petri dish was just mutating, and these things were coming up and bubbling around, and smoke was coming out, and new organisms were being formed. And our role was to monitor, watch, understand, and then decide which of those we would like to support over time. So that was our role. It was a passive role, but a very, very important role. So now things get very serious. Now we've got to start wrapping up at this point. Things get very serious. Barnard develops a close rapport with Nelson Mandela and becomes a deeply personal relationship. And if you're interested, you can Google, there was a wonderful talk given by Barnard before his death on the public broadcast network in America. It was a really incredibly insightful conversation that was had with the interviewer and Barnard, in which he described the status that Mandela had and the profound respect that he inculcated in Barnard, and the fact that Barnard knew that he was looking at the next president of the country. And he couldn't go back and tell the Hawks the stuff, because then the Hawks and the Project Jewel's going to come and assassinate him. So you can't do that. So you've got that sort of that finer edge that we're living under. So now a decision is made to launch 3 tracks, 3 parallel tracks, and I'll just quickly touch base on those. If you're interested, we can deal with them in questions. The 3 tracks are: the first one is to convince the Hawks that communism is no longer a risk. So we believe that Russia is going to implode, and lo and behold, there, Russia, 1989, boom, USSR implodes. So, whoa, we've got a feather in our cap. We got it right, and now suddenly we've got the attention of the Hawks. They're listening to us now. That wasn't easy because of the bombing and all that stuff, Then the second track was to convince other African governments that it's no longer in their best interest to support the armed struggle. Now, how was that done? Because South Africa didn't have embassies in most of Africa. That was done service to service. And I can't tell you how that was done. If you're interested, we can deal with it in question time. But then the third track was really an interesting one. That was a track to reach out to Russia, to try and get Russia to rethink their support to the South African Communist Party. Now, this is a tall order, very tall order. And this was happening at a time because we knew that the USSR was collapsing. We knew that Gorbachev was under severe pressure. So there was a very delicate set of conversations that took place, but it was facilitated by the KGB. And Barnard had a direct meeting with Gorbachev. And in the process, certain agreements were reached. He informed Gorbachev of the intention to negotiate, to have a peaceful negotiated ending, and he suggested to Gorbachev that Russia might want to rethink their position to try and position themselves in a better position in the outcome, whatever's going to come out, but it's going to be a game-changing outcome. And of course, we knew that the Russians were very interested in our military equipment, and they had a MiG fighter aircraft, and we had a Mirage F1s, and the seed was planted. Let's do a joint operation to put a MiG engine into a Mirage. And suddenly, wow, who ever thought of that thing now, okay? And that takes on a life of its own. And I mentioned now this Substack that I'm busy with now. We're going to be doing an interview very soon with one of the chief engineers that was responsible for that whole thing. So these 3 tracks are running now in parallel. Barnard is kind of trying to keep them together. But Barnard prepares Mandela by taking him off Robben Island and putting him in Victor Verster. Why is that important? Robben Island, think of Rottnest Island. Rottnest Island is a tourist place. Robben Island is not a tourist place. So in case of Robben Island, there's one ferry station, and there's journalists sitting at that ferry station, and they know that there's either a prisoner being ferried or there's something else happening. So they've got this thing under surveillance. So we've got to break that surveillance cycle. And the decision made to bring him off the island onto the mainland into Victor Verster, where we can control the environment better. And he's taken out of a prison cell and he's put in a house. And he's given clothes to wear, and he's spoken to with civility and deep respect and really genuine, profound respect grew. Nelson Mandela looked at his jailer, and he felt that his jailer was as much in need of liberation as he himself was, which was a remarkable moment that came out of that thing. So things happen now at Victor Verster prison, and the Hawks now cannot get their head around this because they're distracted by all this extrajudicial killing fallout, all these commissions of inquiry, and Magnus Malone is removed as Minister of Defence. There are 3 commissions of inquiry that are thundering around there, Harmstein and Goldstone, and all of a sudden, the military and the police are as overwhelmed as Bureau of State Security was in the 1970s. But NIS fills this vacuum, and the important thing now in filling the vacuum with the daily intelligence briefings to all clients, one of those briefings goes to Nelson Mandela in prison. So he's briefed, and of course when you brief, you select what you've got to brief about, but you bring him into the loop. And that was a very, very important moment. And Barnard developed this very close relationship with Madiba, and he was also briefing his boss, P.W. Botha. So he was keeping P.W. Botha abreast of this whole thing. And lo and behold, they decide that they're going to meet, and Barnard introduces Mandela to Botha. So there you see that's the moment of introduction. It's I think a very, very poignant image. This is the moment, you can say, that power changed hands in South Africa. Okay, now a lot of that is written up in these books. I've just mentioned the names of the books there. I'm prepared to leave the PowerPoint. If anyone wants the PowerPoint, you're welcome to get it, as long as you attribute what I'm saying. Okay, now I've got to build trust. So now this release has taken place. We've got to start building trust. So Mandela is treated with respect, and after meeting P.W. Botha, he's now sanctioned, if you like. P.W. Botha has sanctioned this whole process, and he's given a briefcase of classified documents to peruse. So these are sensitive documents that were of interest to the ANC, SACP, and from that moment onwards, Mandela was regularly briefed. You'll see that briefcase there. There's my little briefcase here. That is made out of ostrich skin. Mine is made out of buffalo hide. I was an operational guy. Those were boys that were working in offices. They had soft hands. So the ANC and SACP had now established secure communications, and this is very important because we wanted Mandela in prison to be able to communicate with his leadership outside the country. And as things would happen, the police got involved. We knew about this. We cracked the code. We were listening. We got all of those messages as verification of what we were talking about. And lo and behold, the police go and crack down and arrest people. So this whole thing gets broken up now. So now what do we do now? We got to pick up the pieces. Now there's just a little important aside that I want to just share with you. At this stage we were quite on top of our game, and SWAPO in Namibia was about to take over power in Namibia. And I mentioned earlier on that SWAPO was very close to the UN, and there was a decision made by UN that all forces must be confined to barracks, so that there must be a ceasefire. And because SWAPO was so close to the UN, they said, no one's going to do anything about it, and SWAPO launched an operation that, a surge. They put hundreds, if not thousands, of fighters over the border to try and change the situation. Now, this was foolish of them because it didn't change the outcome, but it became the only time that the United Nations mandated South African combat forces to go and work under the United Nations banner. 6-1 MEC was one, and Kufut, the special police force, they were mandated, Operation Merlane, and that became a ding-dong battle. But we learnt about this. We learnt that these communist forces, they don't act in good faith. So when they say they're going to be good boys, they're not necessarily good boys. So you've always got to verify. We had to always verify. So we knew about that, and lo and behold, what happens is during Operation Vula, some smart guy in London develops an encrypted communication system. Computers, laptops will come. Not even laptops. In those days, they were still desktops with floppy disks. Remember floppy disks? And these floppy disks were the process. And some clever guy in London, a very, very smart guy, movies have been made about him now, how clever he is. And he developed a crypto system. And that crypto system needed crypto keys. And if you know anything about intelligence and espionage, if you are carrying encrypted crypto keys across an international border, you're engaged in espionage. So if you get bombarded, if you get caught by the local authorities crossing a border with a crypto key in your possession, you better believe it, you're going down the river, you're going down. So we hear about this, and that individual there is the courier. So what do? We got a choice now. We look at that courier, and that courier works for an international airline. And as you know, there's international protocols, international airlines that fly into Perth International Airport. They don't go through all the customs procedures that the ordinary guys do. They've got a privileged special track. So what do we do now? Do we go and lodge a complaint at the airline, say you've broken the rules? Do we lodge an official complaint at the government, a Dutch government, say that you've broken the rules again? Remember Klaus de Jonge? Or do we just let it carry on? And we decide to just let it carry on. And we let it carry on, and standard operational protocol kicks in, and we do intensive surveillance. And lo and behold, just by some magic, some sleight of hand, we managed to get access to the crypto codes. So now we've got access to the crypto codes so we can read all the stuff. Now, wonderful stuff. Vula is breached. And in my book, Shaking Hands with Billy, some of you have bought copies tonight, I talk about a night that I was called in by some senior guys. I was told we're going away for a few days, pack a bag. We're going away for a few days. I asked, where are we going? We can't tell you. Just pack your bag for a few days. And I reported I was the most junior guy in the group of 3 NI officers. And the police had just handed over one of the guys that they'd captured from Vula. And they asked us if we had any need for this guy. And we decided we're going to do what Salu Scouts used to do. We're going to turn this guy if we can. And I was made the guy to debrief this man. And it's all in that book, Shaking Hands with Billy. I won't go into the debriefing, but the debriefing took place in a bushveld setting with lions literally 50 to 100 meters away. And the lions had made a kill that night, and they were eating the zebra that they just killed. And the bush was just alive with zebras and with lions and hyenas and jackals and you name it. And we were busy debriefing this guy, and we turned him. And he became one of our very productive agents in place. So 1989, Operation Flare brings the ANC into the process now. So now, okay, I think I'm running out of time now.
Long out of time.
I'm long out of time. Okay, so I'm going to wrap it up at this stage then. Okay, I'm going to wrap it up by saying that what I've tried to share with you tonight is a different sort of narrative that you've heard about South Africa. It's about an intelligence service that was, I think, proud to be fairly sophisticated. They achieved, in my view, remarkable things, and I must confess I am biased. I'm one of them. I'm biased, but so I say that in humbleness and all honesty. And we managed to pull the rabbit out of the fire. We managed to pull the rabbit out of the hat, and we managed to negotiate a transition. What we didn't get right was we could not project the future about future state failure, future institutional instability, and the criminalization of the state. We were unable to predict that. And I'll just close by saying that in our euphoric state at that time, there was literally a euphoria in South Africa because the number of killings that had happened. I've got some stats here. I'll quickly give you some stats. I'll just go through that very fast there now. I'll just quickly give you some stats here now. So these stats here, look at that. Between 19 to 1994, there were 14,000 deaths and 22,000 injuries. And if you look over here, I'll just give all the stats here. The Soviet-Afghan War saw 15,000 soldiers killed in action, 1 million Afghans injured or wounded. The Gulf War saw between 25 and 50,000. And in South Africa, under National Party rule, there were 21,000 deaths. So it was a very violent period in our history. And this stat is the important one. There were at least plus minus 400 assassinations. We don't have the full amount because a lot of them were covered up. But 400, at least 173 of those are related to Project Dual. So my people, my men and women, we had a lot of women, we worked in the shadow of that. And I'm very proud to represent them here tonight. And I'm also, I was given this Pioneer Award as a founding member of the Secret Service. And more importantly, I want to pay my respect to every single person, every single citizen, black, white, pink, green, or yellow. I don't care what color you are. I pay my respect to you because your lives were irretrievably altered by those decades of extreme violence, extreme violence. I'm a 12th generation African, and for 12 generations, I'm the custodian of my family history. For 12 generations, we've lived with intergenerational violence. And I'll close by saying South Africa, in my view, is a traumatized society today. And we need to do something to help the South Africans find their way back again, because the experiment in South Africa is too important to fail. We want them to succeed. Even though I live here now, we want South Africa to succeed. So that's my closing statement. I thank you very much. I'll gladly take any
I was a fresh graduate in '86 and I was posted to South Africa to test a new technology which we mainly used in oil and gas, but we were testing it for gold. So I was very fortunate to work all over South Africa, from the Botswana border, where I was trained by the ASIDF to recognize terrorist stuff. I already knew that from Belfast, so I didn't need it. Down to Port Elizabeth, Kruger National Park across the Potchefstroom, I was very much aware of the enclaves in Lesotho and Swaziland.
Yeah.
But what I wanted to ask you was just a simple question about Soweto.
Yeah.
And most of you obviously know, some of you may not, but Soweto was one of the largest black townships outside Johannesburg. In your role in intelligence, how, in the late 80s when I was there, because I've heard so many different things, how dangerous actually was Soweto?
African people are generally quite warm and loving. They're responsive and they're ordinary, they're lovely people. But there is an angry youth that's out there. There's an angry group of people, and these are unpredictable. So the first time I ever went into Soweto was actually as a soldier. And I was actually deployed in the first group of soldiers ever. In my book, I talk about it. We were deployed in the very, very first group of soldiers when the police lost control on the East Rand townships. And the police were overwhelmed, they were swamped, so they put us in armored combat people, pull us out of Angola and put us into the townships. And that became my sort of pivotal moment, because I realized just how violent these South Africa had become. That is a place called Kamalo Street, East Rand Township, Tokoza, Vosloorus, Tembisa. I know that area very, very well. And I would not recommend anyone going to those places when there's unrest happening, because it's just simply too unpredictable. But today, Soweto is actually, a very peaceful place. And Soweto, in the overall scheme of things, was actually one of the least violent places of South Africa. The most violent townships were the East Rand, Tokoza, Vosloorus, and they were all townships where there was a very, very strong Zulu faction. What I didn't have time to show you is the difference between Zulu and the rest. There was a big war that took place after Mandela was released in KZN between the IFP and MK, and that was just a very violent time. So yeah, I hope that answers your question.
I'm just wondering what Cuba and Russia were doing in Angola and South Africa.
Okay, that's an interesting question. So Russia was there as part of the Brezhnev Doctrine. So the Brezhnev Doctrine was the opposite. You can almost think of Article 5 of NATO that says if one NATO member is attacked, then all other NATO members must come. Well, Brezhnev said that we'll have this thing called the Brezhnev Doctrine, and if any country is defending communism and someone's trying to stop it, then we all communist nations are obliged to go. So Russia saw themselves very much as the sort of vanguard of that. And Cuba, it was a very complicated story, but just to make it as simple as I can, Cuba was ruled by one man, Fidel Castro. He was as angry as a snake because he'd been betrayed by Khrushchev during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and he wanted to get his revenge against America, and he wanted to get his revenge against Russia, because Khrushchev made a decision about removing the missiles without his permission. So he treated Cuba as a surrogate. And Cuba was never a surrogate. They were a proud, independent nation. They wanted to be treated with independence. So when the Cubans came in after the Battle of Kifongondo, the Cubans came in, and it just became a remarkable change, because suddenly the FOPLA forces became very professional, very, very coordinated. They were still reliant on on Russian hardware, but as fighting people, they were very, very formidable. Believe me.
Who devised the Truth and Reconciliation Commission? Was it successful, and do you think they need another one to help dealing with it?
That's a great question. So the Truth and Reconciliation Commission was, in my view, one of the pivotal moments in South Africa. It's the only time that we know of where, for example, I mentioned the fact that Mandela looked at his jailer and said that you are also in need of liberation. And it was the only time that victim and perpetrator could be brought together. And that was a really remarkable time. Now, from NI's side, from the Faceless Few side, not one person ever had to apply for amnesty at the Truth Commission, because we were never involved in those sort of atrocities. But the CCB, they had lots and lots of people that had to apply for amnesty. Was it a bitter pill to swallow? You better believe it. If you were a family of people that Robert McBride had blown up, you still to this day, you're angry. And in fact, you're not only angry with Robert McBride, you're angry with Anthony Turton, because Anthony Turton was part of the process that sold you down the river to bring the enemy in through the back door by negotiating with the terrorists. So there's still a lot of ill feelings to this day. I've got a target on my back. I've got 2 targets on my back. One is from the white right. The white right would love to take me out. And the other one is a group of people called the Izinkabi. Izinkabi, these are hitmen. These are professional hitmen that would love to take me out, because these guys keep the criminal syndicates in control. And in my work in the water sector, I've been very strongly involved in trying to get rid of the criminal elements that control the water network. So if I had to go back to South Africa tomorrow, in all probability, I would have a very unpleasant welcome. Izinkabi, they take you out for 5,000 rand.
My name is Dr. Simon Wamono. I just wanted to know what was the main reason the nuclear program in South Africa for civilian use disbanded.
A decision was made at that point in time. There was a lot of things that happened very quickly. P.W. Botha had a stroke, and he failed to cross the Rubicon. You know that Rubicon speech of his. There was a disinvestment from banks. South Africa became uninvestable. And Botha was supposed to make the speech now to restore confidence. It didn't happen. And then he had the stroke, so he couldn't do anything about it. But people were afraid to actually kick him out of office. So he was mentally impaired, but he was still in power. So F.W. de Klerk was...
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. Absolutely. There are parallels. You won't believe the parallels. And so F.W. de Klerk came to power the very day that Neil Barnard came back from the trip to Switzerland, where they met Thabo Mbeki and Mac Maharaj and Jacob Zuma. They met in secret. So the very first meeting that F.W. de Klerk chaired of the State Security Council, Neil Barnard reported back on the successful meeting, and F.W. went ballistic. He said, but who gave you the authority to go negotiate with the enemy? So F.W. is painted as this dove and this peacemaker, but actually he was very angry. And of course Barnard, he covered his tracks very well. He had the authorization from the State Security Council to do this, and he basically was brought into the understanding. So the decision was made as part and parcel of the way forward. We had to get different foreign governments, particularly the British and Americans. We had to get their buy-in. The Russians, we had to get their buy-in as well. They were all interested in this. None of those people wanted chemical, biological, and nuclear weapons in the hands of any African government. So part of the deal was, just get rid of these things, come clean, put your hand up and say, I've got these things in my backyard, we're going to get rid of them. And that's what happened. Now, the fallout from that, of course, is still reverberating to this day. But nonetheless, we had 6.5 weapons that were made. And just to put you in the picture, South Africa at that stage was at the point of putting those nuclear warheads onto missiles. So the missile development technology, one of the guys that I worked with in my subsequent civilian life was the head of that missile program. So we had a sophisticated missile technology program decades before the Middle East got hold of it. And one of the important delivery vehicles for that nuclear warhead was an artillery piece. The G5 cannon that could shoot something like 60 kilometers. So it was a tactical nuclear device, not a strategic level nuclear device. It was an artillery shell, not a rocket. So it was quite sophisticated in its day, but nonetheless it was all given up. And the chemical and biological stuff is still reverberating to this day. There's still fallout from the chemical and biological stuff. Dr. Wouter Besson, if you Google his name, you'll see he's still in court every single day, and his medical license to practice has been revoked and given back, and his whole life has just been consumed by this Project Coast.
Amazing. That's a very important case study in disarmament and non-proliferation that's studied all around the world.
Yeah.
Of all the various numerous operations you've been involved with, was there any stage where you lost hope that there'd be a peaceful transition?
I subsequently in my life, I had a privilege of meeting Mikhail Gorbachev myself. This was after all of the dust settled, and one of Gorbachev's advisors was a rabbi. And I grew up as a small boy with a lot of Jewish people, because I was born in the 1950s, post-war reconstruction taking place in South Africa, and a lot of Jewish kids that were product of the Holocaust. So I grew up very closely to Jewish people, and I saw this. One of Gorbachev's advisors was a rabbi, And suddenly, what's a rabbi doing advising Gorbachev? And then I met the rabbi, in fact, in a Starbucks cafe in Kyoto, of all places. So we're having coffee in Starbucks. And
Sounds like the start of a song.
yeah. And I said to him, but Rabbi, I'm very interested in your story as an advisor to Gorbachev. But your surname is not a Jewish name, it's Suttendorp. His name was Aviram Suttendorp. And I said, how does this work out? And it turns out that going back to Anne Frank's day, Jewish families had to evacuate Amsterdam, and they put their babies in a suitcase. In this case, they put the baby in a suitcase, and they left the baby on the front doorstep of the Suttendorp family. He had to, the people opened up the front door and there was a baby. So they had to decide what to do now. And they decided to adopt this baby and to give the baby the Suttendorp name. But what he told me now is the following, it's very profound. He was told, even though you've got the name of Suttendorp, never forget that you're Jewish. And never forget your heritage. And he then said something that just blew my mind away. And he said, a person can live for days without water, weeks without food, but not a moment without hope. So hope became a central part of everything that we did. We could never wake up if I woke up every morning and thought about the possible assassination attempts that I was going to have to jump over, the hurdles that I have to navigate that day, I would have gone cuckoo. So we all were, I think maybe ridiculously optimistic. But that ridiculous optimism just brought us through. We profoundly believed, and we had access to inside knowledge, so we knew about things that were happening that other South Africans didn't know about. South Africa was a very closed, private society at that stage. People didn't know. The government didn't share information freely. So we had privileged information of what was going on. And the hope always sprung eternal. And just in closing, I think one of the things that I talk about, if I've ever talked about leadership, or the role of leadership today, is about finding a vision of hope, getting people to buy into that vision, getting enthusiastic and competent people to buy into that vision, and then bring them along with you. So a future is not about dividing people and creating enemies and artificial people that we want to beat up. And that's not leadership. That's retrograde. Leadership is about saying we've got to go this way, and it's not going to be easy, and we don't know all the answers. But please, understand this is the best thing that we can do. So that's. I hope I've answered your question. But it's just this inherent optimism that we had.
I think that's a really good point to end with hope.
Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate it. Thank you.